Welcome to part 4, the attributes of X. At this point, we know that we have faith in X to explain absolute behavior. So naturally, that raises the question of what X is. We can use logic to answer that, which is the purpose of part 4. The first attribute of X is that it is uncaused. Premise 1 states that if X is caused, then it could not be the ultimate explanation of absolute behavior. In that case, whatever caused X would be the ultimate explanation, not X. This contradicts what we said earlier about X being the ultimate explanation of absolute behavior. So the conclusion is that X is uncaused. Here's our updated diagram with the first attribute of X being that it is uncaused. The next attribute is that X is infinitely powerful. Premise 1 states that if X was not infinitely powerful, then its power would be finite. This is by definition. Premise 2 states that if the power of X was finite, then something could theoretically have more power than X. As long as the power of X is finite, then something with greater finite power than X could theoretically exist. Premise 3 states that nothing can theoretically have more power than X. This is because if something theoretically had more power than X, then it could theoretically change what X made absolute. But that contradicts our definition of absolutes, which is that they cannot be changed even theoretically. And the only way for nothing to theoretically have more power than X is if X is infinitely powerful. Here is our updated diagram with X being infinitely powerful. Our next attribute is that X is singular. We are ruling out the idea that X is some kind of coalition of things that work together to create absolute behavior. An example would be the gods in some polytheistic religion. The fact that such a coalition is not possible is seen by the following argument. Premise 1 states that if X is infinitely powerful, then at least one member of X must be infinitely powerful. Here we are assuming that the number of members is finite. If those members had finite power, then the power of X would also be finite. It doesn't matter how big two finite numbers are, if they're put together, you will still get a finite number. So the only way to achieve the infinite power of X is to have one infinitely powerful member. Premise 2 states that if one member of X is infinitely powerful, then the other members cannot have any power. The definition of infinitely powerful is that one's power has no limits. So if the other members had power of their own, then that would be power that our infinitely powerful member does not have, thus making it not infinitely powerful. Premise 3 states that if the other members of X cannot have any power, then they cannot be part of X. One needs power to be part of X because X does something, which is to explain absolute behavior. If power is required to be part of X and the other members don't have power, then they cannot be part of X. Premise 4 states that if the other components cannot be part of X, then X has only one component. That is, because X is infinitely powerful, it must have one infinitely powerful component, which by definition rules out the presence of other components. Premise 5 states that if X has only one component, then X is singular. Premise 6 states that X is infinitely powerful, which yields a conclusion that X is singular. I realize this argument is abstract, so feel free to pause the video and review. The only reason I included this is because it's an important attribute. So here's our updated diagram with X is singular deriving from X is infinitely powerful. Attribute 4 is that X is supernatural. Premise 1 states that if X was limited to the natural laws, then it could not have explained our belief in absolute behavior. Remember how science and the natural laws cannot explain our belief in absolute behavior. So if X was limited to the natural laws, it could not have done something that the natural laws can't do. Premise 2 states that X did explain absolute behavior, with the conclusion being that X is not bound by the natural laws. In other words, if X can justify our position of faith, which is beyond the ability of science, then X cannot be bound by science. And technically, one could also say that if X was not supernatural, then it couldn't be infinitely powerful. Here's our updated diagram. X is immaterial, meaning it is not made of matter. Premise 1 states that if X were made of matter, then it would have to obey the natural laws. This is because all matter obeys the natural laws. However, that would contradict X being supernatural, which yields the conclusion that X is not made of matter. Here we have X is immaterial, deriving from X is supernatural. Attribute 6 is that X is timeless, meaning it does not experience time. Premise 1 states that if X experienced time, then everything X did would take time. This is true by definition. Premise 2 states that if everything X did took time, then the creation of absolute behavior would have taken time. Premise 3 states that the creation of absolute behavior cannot have taken time. If the creation of absolute behavior took time, then absolute behavior would not exist at the points of time before it was created. But absolute behavior must exist at all points in time, which yields a conclusion that X does not dwell within time. For example, if X took time to make logic behave consistently, then there would be a time before X was finished where 2 plus 2 could equal 5, which we believe is impossible. So X created absolute behavior, but it did not take X time to do that. Here we have X being timeless. X is eternal, meaning it has no beginning or end. Premise 1 states that if X does not experience time, then it has no beginning or end. Conversely, if X had a beginning or an end, then that would be proof that it experiences time. Premise 2 states that if X has no beginning or end, then it is eternal. This is true by definition. X does not experience time, meaning that it is also eternal. Here we have X as eternal, deriving from X as timeless. The eighth and last attribute is that X is alive. This is because if X was not alive, then it could not have a will. Even the most complex non-living thing we could think of, like a supercomputer, does not have a will because it can only do what it was programmed to do. It cannot make choices. The attribute of having a will belongs specifically to living things. We know that X has a will from the non-random nature of absolute behavior. If something is not random, then it is deliberate, which requires a will on the part of X. If X has a will and a will is unique to living things, then X is also alive. Here is our updated diagram. Let's summarize what we have covered from the beginning. Starting in part 1, I showed that everyone believes in the existence of absolute behavior. I never said that absolute behavior exists, just that we all believe it exists. In part 2, I showed that belief in absolute behavior is a position of faith because it cannot be proven or disproven by science or by logic. We combined parts 1 and 2 to say that everyone has faith that absolute behavior exists. Then we added part 3, which states that absolute behavior needs an explanation X because of the non-random nature of absolute behavior. This yielded the conclusion of parts 1 through 3, which is that everyone has faith in X to explain absolute behavior. We added to that conclusion part 4, which states that X must be uncaused, infinitely powerful, singular, supernatural, immaterial, timeless, eternal, and alive. You might have guessed it, but X has the attributes of a monotheistic deity, which we can call God with a capital G. We know that it is monotheistic because X is singular. We don't know which monotheistic deity X is, or even if humans have discovered the deity yet. But we do know that we can call it capital G God because of its monotheistic attributes. Of course, I can't prove that X is God using logic. That would be impossible because God is an infinite being. But I can show it beyond a reasonable doubt. Again, if someone doesn't like that technically they need faith to believe that X is God, then they are more than welcome to stop having faith in absolute behavior. That is, if one wants to reject this argument because one needs a tiny bit of faith to believe that X is God, then they should at least be consistent and reject their own faith in absolute behavior. But if one accepts absolute behavior, then they should have no problem accepting that X is God. So if everyone has faith in God to explain absolute behavior and X is God, then the final conclusion is that everyone has faith in God to explain absolute behavior. This faith may not be conscious. Not everyone acknowledges with their words that they have faith in God, but such faith exists nonetheless because only God can justify our belief in absolute behavior. I realize that it is not popular in our fiercely independent culture to say that we are completely dependent on faith in God, yet that is what the logic supports. If someone has a problem with this, then like I said earlier, they are more than welcome to abandon their belief in absolute behavior, which would make them exempt. Remember, the gist of this argument is not that I am proving God's existence. I am merely showing that you, the viewer, assumed God's existence when you chose to meet condition 1. So if you meet condition 1, then God exists for you. But if you don't meet it, then God doesn't exist for you. And if one decides they want to reject condition 1, then like I said, they are welcome to start by buying that safety strap for when gravity shuts off. So that's the end of part 4. In part 5, we will discuss the implications of parts 1 through 4.